So I'm here today to talk about curating topic near and dear to our hearts at Rhizome, because since the organization was founded in 1996, online exhibition has really been a part of our practice throughout most of that time. Topic that we take very seriously, and we draw on a lot of learning and mistakes from the past as we move forward with this practice. I published an article on Rhizome last year, and some of this talk will be drawn from that, and the rest of it will be the second part as yet unpublished, which we can discuss at the end. So I also wanted to flag that I'm going to be talking both about contemporary and historical examples. I believe this is part of a series on preserving, on technological arts preservation, which is a kind of key part of this talk, but it's not sort of the only thing. But for Rhizome as a whole, that's something that really informs our practice, both when we're thinking historically and when we're thinking about the present day. Rhizome has maintained an archive called the Art Base since 1999 that contains more than 2,000 artworks that use new technologies, or technologies that were new at the time of their making. And so so this area of research is really central to everything we do, including curating online exhibitions, whether the works are recent or old. So we are an online organization, but we're also, and we have quite a long history. This is kind of our early web page from 1996 when we were rhizome.com. And we've always had this interesting status as an organization that focused on new practices, brought together community, and also focused on archiving as a central part of the work that we do since almost the beginning. In 2003, Rhizome partnered with the New Museum of Contemporary Art. So now we have this special status as an independent organization that also has kind of a foothold in the museum world. And I think that perspective, where we speak from inside the museum, but also independently, gives us a really unique perspective on curating online exhibitions as well. So that's a little bit about us. And now let's get into the topic at hand, which is, of course, one that's particularly relevant, because with access to exhibitions around the world now quite limited as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, institutions and artists now face questions about online exhibition making with sudden urgency. The task might at first seem relatively straightforward for many institutions who want to just provide a point of access for the general public to programs and information that would otherwise be experienced in person. But for an audience that's dealing with all of the hardship of pandemic, boredom or grief or whatever else, online exhibitions that are presented just as a stand-in for a real gallery experience may only serve as a reminder of a life on hold, inviting direct comparison with the real thing, the real exhibition, and drawing attention to what's missing from the experience. But our online exhibition can be more than a space of simulation, documentation, promotion, and access. Institutions that hope to really realize their missions online during this period and beyond would do well to engage in a deeper consideration of the specificities and histories of online exhibition making. This can be a challenge, though. The histories are not particularly well documented, the specificities not so thoroughly mapped, and given the sheer variety of forms that online exhibition can take, it can be difficult to even answer the question, what is an online exhibition? It could be a crowdfunding exhibition, a crowdfunding campaign offering artists multiples to backers. This is one online exhibition. It could be a file downloaded to a user's computer, an HTML page featuring thumbnails and links to artists' work, a 3D recreation of a famous gallery neighborhood in New York. Any of these could be online exhibition. So while gallery exhibition has a recognizable default in white cube sort of architecture, visitors to an online exhibition can expect to encounter any number of structures and formats. At best, this categorical instability allows viewers to understand exhibition making as a variable and contingent practice dependent on particular context, and also allows them to imagine how it might or might not outlive the white cube. But at worst, this kind of diversity of forms is just bewildering. given the gonzo history of experimentation in online exhibitions, it's easy to lose one's grasp on what an online exhibition even is. So of course we have to start by trying to think about definitions. This is a definition that sort of maybe represents a traditional museum studies view of what exhibition making is. Exhibition involves imposition of order on objects brought into a particular space in a specific set of relations with each other. Of course, in the online context, each of these terms comes under new pressure. So first, we can talk about objects. Digital artworks that appear to be coherent objects are rather the performance of objecthood. What I mean by that is that born digital artworks and cultural artifacts, works that depend on the computer for their creation and reception, can be experienced only when enacted within complex ensembles of hardware and software, and may also rely on audience participation, external websites or media, and or any range of other elements. So it's not so much that they are displayed as they are performed. So object already becomes a problematic term. Further, online exhibitions don't take place in a particular unified space, rather than a mere arrangement of works in an architectural setting. Online exhibition involves arranging a multifaceted mise-en-scène to accommodate an unfolding event that might involve, it might involve, as we just saw, 3D recreations of a virtual space, but also involves a number of other elements that we'll talk about. And then even the question of order is quite complex when it comes to the online world, because specific sets of relations that a curator may try to create within an online context are often refracted through the kinds of processes that play out online. Exhibitions are, as a whole, are social processes, and online exhibitions are social processes that play out via computer networks, therefore become quite complex and in some ways indeterminate. So each of these terms becomes quite difficult to use in practice when making online exhibitions. So with these caveats in mind, I made an effort at a restating of this type of definition. Online exhibition involves the performance of artworks and their objecthood in a particular mise-en-scène, brought into dynamic relationship with one another and a broader network context. Before unpacking this further, I wanted to talk about that first word, the word online, because this is also sort of like a central part of the definition as a whole. There's an important discussion to be had about the relationship between online and offline exhibition, and likewise about the relationship between online exhibition of an artwork that's created and experienced versus the use via a computer, and online exhibition of work that's created to be in a physical sense and kind of intended as a physical work. So we could say that there's considerable crossover between physical and digital artwork that's experienced online and off. And we'll talk about a couple of examples of that in a moment. But in thinking about the online context, I wanted to kind of revisit the work of scholar Julie Cohen. And we don't have to get into this in detail, it's in the article, but we need to keep in mind as we talk about the online context that online culture isn't an exceptional world of its own, but it's inherently connected to an extension of everyday life. So it's both evolution of everyday life and sort of it's sort of both an extension of everyday life and a break from it. So Julie Cohen, I think, is one of the best theorists of kind of the online context as something that's both distinct from and connected to everyday life. She argues that that you could use the word sort of heterotopia to discuss that. Anyway, that's another topic. So we need to think, as we talk about online exhibition, as a practice that's connected to physical reality, to everyday reality, even though it does bring in its own specificities. So along these lines, the online exhibition is best understood as distinct from and connected to the embodied and situated experience of practitioners and of the physical gallery world. One example of the way that this functions is that audiences have long been conditioned to experience physical exhibitions online. And this is something that artists have played with in interesting ways. A nice example of this from a few years back is Generation Works, which was a curated series by artist Jasper Spissero that took place in in a foreclosed condo in downtown Tacoma, Washington that admitted no visitors. So these exhibitions were only available through documentation on this evocative handmade website that created a kind of narrative about a sort of fictional narrative about what this space was. A more recent example, and this is something, there's been a lot of projects like this during the pandemic. Final Hot Desert is one example of an artist initiative that's making these installations in spaces that no one can easily visit. So here are paintings installed at the entrance of an abandoned mine shaft. And then they post the documentation online. So the presumption is that 99.9% of the audience is seeing these through documentation. So this is where that slippage between online and offline exhibition needs to be sort of embraced. And I think one of the interesting implications of this, if we accept that online and offline exhibition are already interconnected, is that the sort of the questions that arise in online exhibition can then be thought of as having implications for the more rarefied and incontrovertible sort of language of gallery exhibition making. So all of the ideas we discuss in online exhibition can then be applied back to the gallery world. This is a reason why I think it's particularly urgent for institutions and curators to grapple with online exhibition practice, even if it's not a primary arena of their work. So I've made an argument for why it's important to consider the specificity of the online context, even though it's quite and because it's quite connected to physical gallery world. I wanted to describe what I think is sort of the most crucial concept within the specificity of online exhibitions, which is a concept that's frequently discussed around born digital art, which is the concept of variability. Variability is a concept that's been articulated by a number of writers. One of the key sort of advocates of the concept was Lev Manovich with his 2001 book, Language of New Media. He argued that variability suggests that the same set of data can be accessed in numerous ways depending on factors like hardware or software environment. So whether an online exhibition consists of documentation of physical work or born digital work, variability makes the question of what the exhibited work actually is and how to present it in a stable and coherent way rather vexing. The topic arose again in the work of Boris Groys in his 2008 book, Art Power, where he framed digital exhibition as a form of performance. Groys argued the digital image is a copy, but the event of its visualization is an original event because the digital copy is a copy that has no visible original. In other words, a digital image to be seen should not be merely exhibited, but staged, performed. So the practice of online exhibition involves making certain choices regarding a work's performance. Now, in those decisions, Groys places great emphasis on the role of the technical apparatus in which a work is performed. In particular, he highlights that curatorial decision as to whether to perform a legacy digital artwork within its original apparatus or to interpret it in a new form. He argues that if the work is shown in its original format, the format itself can begin to overshadow the artist's intent or the work. And an overemphasis on technical apparatus can cloud an audience's understanding of that. So this is a topic or a type of decision that we had to make frequently in doing the project Net Art Anthology that Osman mentioned at the start. Net Art Anthology was an initiative to sort of retell a history of net art through 100 works from the 1980s to the present, which would be restaged and reperformed. So you can access this online exhibition online. There's also various other aspects of the project that included gallery, exhibition, and book. But it was really online exhibition first. And so in staging these works, we had to decide in many cases whether to use the original technological apparatus of a given work or to perform it in a kind of new way, in some cases with the artist's participation. So, for example, this is a work, well, I'm going to start with this one. Next one. I'm going to go slightly out of order here. So this is a kind of nice example of a work that that has survived since it went online originally in 1997. It's a website called Formart, and it was a competition run by artist Alexei Shulgin that invited people to use the default elements of HTML forms like drop-down menus and radio buttons to create simple animations and games. It's very sweet. This was archived by the organization C3 and is existed online, except as you can see, when the work was originally presented in 1997 on Netscape 3, it had a very different appearance. Instead of the white background, this gray background. Instead of the rounded buttons, square buttons. So even though the work's files were entirely intact, the performance of it within the technological context did change significantly. In this case, enough to where it's really changing the experience that the audience would have of the work. So in restaging this for Net Art Anthology, our preservation director, Dragan Espenšed, and set up an emulation environment in which users could access the work in that Netscape 3 browser, giving them an experience that was more in line with how these animations and games were intended to appear. At Rhizome, we use the metaphor of the object boundary to help guide conversations about the role that a given software or network context might play in relation to a given work. So in the context of network software, the object boundary is not a given, but a variable, and drawing the object boundary is a curatorial decision often made in discussion with the artists. In this case, the object boundary included the web browser Netscape Navigator 3. An example where the object boundary had to be even broader was this work, The Web Stalker, by a group called IOD. This was made at the height of the browser wars, when Netscape and Internet Explorer were fighting for dominance, and artists were really interested in the question of how web browsers were shaping experiences of the web. So IOD had a premise that that sort of what was fundamental about the web wasn't how the page looked with images and text, but instead how documents were interconnected. So they sought to make a web browser that you could use to navigate the web that highlighted its structure rather than its content. As you can imagine, this created a very different experience of browsing the web. And it's kind of like a real classic of net art. But interestingly, this work only functions with HTTP 1.0. So in order to present the work, we had to provide not only the original software environment, but also a list of URLs of some of the few websites that still run this early web protocol and can be accessed with the browser. So in this case, the boundary of this web browser included not only the software that needed to run it, which of course wasn't made by the artist, but also these external network resources, these external websites that were the only way that it could be kind of used in the present day. So here our object boundaries getting even broader to include things that, aren't even under our control at this point. And the user can access them by following these sort of instructions. It's not the easiest work to use, but it is quite interesting. So as you enter the URL, you can start drawing a kind of diagram of the shape of the network around any given page. So here the browser is visualizing the links among pages, and it's really placing the focus on that rather than on the content of any given page. So in thinking about object boundary, our preservation director, Dragan Espenšed, articulates this as follows. So there's an artifact, which is the resources, such as files that make up the work, which are there even when the computer is turned off. And these resources are performed with other resources, usually ones that were not created by the artist, to come together to perform the object. The object boundary includes whatever is considered to be the artifact, plus the other resources that are brought into the performance. So the artifacts here was the original computer software, and then the resources are the software environment and the websites that we're using. There were also cases in Netart Anthology where, where some of those resources were not available and had to be reconstructed. So this is sort of a fictional reconstruction of an artist's YouTube performance page in which the dialogue with audiences was very important in this work, in which the artist presented herself as a sort of sex cam video blogger. So fans would sort of write in, and the correspondence was really crucial, which meant that the early interface of YouTube was crucial to the work. And so that early interface had to be considered within this performance. Whereas in Ryan Tricarden's IB area and out of order YouTube messy format, the interface of YouTube was incidental to the project. And so in this case, we simply presented it as on the live web and left the interface to be, allowing it to kind of change as YouTube makes updates. What was interesting about YouTube for Ryan was simply just being able to share this in fragmented form with an audience and letting it sort of circulate in that context. So recapturing its appearance at any given time in YouTube's history was not important. And so the YouTube interface was sort of outside of our sort of performance. Interestingly, though, even though, the interface wasn't sort of important, one of the factors that arose with this is that there was a video deleted during the exhibition because of sexual content. It was flagged by a user. This is something that happens all the time with artists that are working in that platform space. So even though the interface wasn't important, this is getting to the point where the platform environment has really altered the work by removing a piece of it. And so in our efforts to deal with that, we presented a live web version of the work, but also created a web capture of it using a tool that we were calling Web Recorder, which is now called Conifer, which is a tool that people may wish to be aware of. What's interesting about Conifer in relation to this conversation is that this is a tool that captures the web as you browse it, so you can create a very clear boundary around whatever artifacts you wish to capture for any given project. It offers an interface similar to this. Now it says Conifer, and you simply navigate to a web page, and everything that you click on during a given session becomes part of that object boundary and can then be reperformed as an interactive web page without relying on external resources that may not be available anymore. So this sort of illustrates the way in which the object boundary becomes really confusing in relation to presenting contemporary work on the web, because the decisions of platforms, all the software apparatus that can come together, all of that can be actually part of the set of artifacts that are needed to create a performance. And so this became a kind of technological problem for us that Conifer was one approach to solving. So as we are navigating here, you can see up here that this archive is growing, 10.72 megabytes, and everything that gets clicked on becomes a part of this archive and can be accessed again later interactively. So not to get too lost in this, it's an endless topic, but variability is a kind of very concrete problem within online exhibition making, and it's also a kind of key aspect of curatorial decision making in terms of understanding that these works can be performed in different kinds of ways in a very material sense, and that those decisions really shape the meaning of an exhibition. But beyond just the concept of variability, which opens up very technical issues in particular, I wanted to talk about the concept of mise en scène. This is a concept that originated in 19th century French theater, where it referred to everything that went into the production of a play apart from the recitation of lines. So that would include the arrangement of scenery, props, lighting, the blocking of actors, setting, and other elements of staging. The term was later adopted in cinema, where it sometimes was expanded to include not only diegetic elements, but also film stock and composition. So things that were never a part of the theater, of course. Rhizome's preservation director, Dragan, who I've mentioned several times, of course, began to use the term several years ago as part of our discussions about online exhibition, and it has proven useful as part of our ongoing work. So this is in keeping with the metaphor of performance, which is a kind of mantra for Rhizome's preservation and curatorial efforts. Digital culture is made up of practices, not objects. So theatrical metaphors, which had already been reinvented for the new medium of cinema, offered particular possibility for digital online exhibition. So what is the mise-en-scène of an online exhibition? All of the elements that come together to create the performatic scene of an online exhibition can be thought of as aspects of its mise-en-scène. This sounds straightforward enough, but the list of these elements is potentially endless because online exhibitions rely on complex ensembles of technological and human factors. So listing each element that comes together to shape an online exhibition proves to be a laborious and unproductive undertaking. And I can tell you this because I tried. But such a list inevitably goes well beyond elements of interface design to include things like server location, user hardware, and so on. And yet each of these parts may be important. As Dragon has contended, all aspects of online exhibition are subject to design and presentation choices and have no natural state. So for example, 20 years ago, no one thought to specify that a particular web-based artwork would require a mouse, because no one anticipated that this mode of human-computer interaction would be replaced. But when exhibiting a legacy artwork in 2020 that depends on actions like hovering over a hyperlink, it becomes necessary to think carefully about how to interpret these actions on a touchscreen device. So something that seemed incredibly default becomes something that has to be thought through carefully as part of a staging of a work. This points to one of the real obstacles to thinking systematically about mise-en-scène. Aspects of an online exhibition's design that may seem fundamental at one point in time may later appear to be completely contingent on context. And by virtue of its sheer expansiveness, the concept of mise-en-scène highlights the limits of curatorial control in online exhibition. Not all of these factors can be scripted or controlled. The goal is not to engineer the online exhibition down to the component level, but to understand the way in which given or easily overlooked factors can play a crucial role in shaping performance and reception of a given online exhibition. So to aid in this process, instead of that exhaustive list of all of the different elements that might make up an online exhibition, Dragon argues that what's important to focus on is what we call productive abstractions, or concepts that don't become embedded in a particular moment and become useless in another, but can be extracted out of any given moment and applied generally across a long span of online exhibition making. So with that, Dragon and I have been developing a list of productive abstractions for online exhibition, and I will share that now. The first one I want to begin with is infrastructure, which isn't something that we necessarily think of as making meaning in online exhibitions, but in fact, and it's often one of the things that's overlooked or thought of as default, but actually infrastructure can play a really important role in how, gone backwards, in how online exhibition plays out. And maybe to give a slightly extreme example of this, this is just some images from Section Arte, which is Nestor Surré's ongoing series of art files that are shared as part of El Paquete Semanal, which is kind of known colloquially as Cuba's offline internet. It's basically a system of media distribution via hard drive that many people in Cuba use to access news, movies, pop culture, etc., any kind of information. So you would take your USB drive to a bodega and you would download some files and take them home and view them on a computer or maybe on like a TV with a USB interface. So there's this is in place of like the kind of internet infrastructure that might exist in New York City. This is a way of sharing files and accessing content and information without that technical infrastructure. So Nestor has conceptualized this project as a way of sharing art within that framework. It's quite long running. I believe it was founded in 2015, but of course the infrastructure of El Paquete Semanal is inextricable from what this project means and how it's interpreted and understood. There are many other examples of how infrastructure can shape online exhibition that are more mundane. One that I wanted to flag was this presentation of Net Art Latino database for Net Art Anthology. And in this case, Net Art Latino database was this ongoing archive of artworks made by Latinx net artists in the early 2000s, compiled by artist Brian McKern. And the of course, it's very interesting to look at many of these works within a legacy browser using a system such as the one I showed earlier, where we saw WebStalker within a legacy environment. But interestingly, that type of presentation on the web relies on having really robust server infrastructure and internet access, which is not available to many of the people in Latin America that that might feel specifically connected to this work. So Brian argued that we should present this not with emulation as its primary point of access, but instead with a video that would be more easily accessed from Latin American networks. So here the infrastructure played a role in how the presentation of the work took shape. If we hadn't done it in this way, then I think it would have created a kind of problem of access that would have reflected a kind of Northern Hemisphere bias or a US bias. So infrastructure is a key part of that mise-en-scène, and it often provides significant detail about one's perspective on the works shown and on the relationship with audiences. The next productive abstraction I wanted to discuss is selection and arrangement. So we talked earlier about how exhibition involves order. And in online exhibition in particular, the imposition of order can be somewhat fluid. It might involve a kind of relation that changes over time. And in particular, with online exhibitions, time does often become a crucial factor. With Net Art Anthology, we staged works one at a time over a period of 2.5 years. And so the exhibition grew, and that temporal dimension became a part of this sort of ordering of works within the exhibition. A similar kind of framework can be seen in Kingdom of Piracy, a 2002 online exhibition developed by Shuli Chang and Armin Madosh with Yukiko Shikata. In this online exhibition, there were like a series of projects that were added over time that reflected like this kind of growing network of artists working together. So exhibition can involve an ordering of works on the space of a kind of website, and that order can also change over time, and that can be a part of the way in which meaning is created in the online exhibition. Oops. Yeah, well, we can think of, so with selection and arrangement, there could be things like chronological sequence that are kind of portrayed, or there could be things like hierarchy, like different categories of concepts. So you can think of selection and order as being a kind of information architecture of an exhibition, and that's something that can be very static, or it can be generated dynamically. So selection and arrangement. The next kind of topic or abstraction to discuss is access, which relates to kind of questions around the interface. Basically, the way in which artwork is presented to the user can reflect curatorial ideas, or it can resemble something like, can be a simulation of an art gallery or something, or it can be somewhere in between. A really nice point of access that I like to refer to is created for this exhibition, The New Outside, curated by Constant Dolart. So here we have a kind of navigation key that allows you to see a kind of view of the exhibition as a whole. And this solves a real problem with online exhibition making, in that it can be very difficult to understand the scale of your experience when you arrive at a website. This is very true of Net Art Anthology, which kind of unfolds into, endless amounts of content. Here we have the same experience one has when walking into a gallery, of being able to kind of view the number of works that are on view at a glance and understanding like a relationship among them. So that relates to selection and order. Clicking on these works would kind of take you to the individual work, and then you kind of go back. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's kind of a point of access that slightly resembles a physical gallery space. So it calls to mind this kind of narrative quality of the salon style of kind of painting installation. And so we have something that's being recreated in the interface that's drawing on a metaphor from gallery history, but it's being brought into this kind of new context where it's quite schematic and dynamic, and there are a number of other elements that allow you to experience this work in a way that's quite specific to the web. There are other examples of points of access that are much more specifically kind of recreating gallery spaces, but I really like this example, Claude Kloski's iGallery, because this is an example of a project that recreates, in a sense, what I think of as like the perfect metaphor of the white cube. So these works are all just external links. So you really can click on them and end up on other web pages where the actual work is presented. Although all of that is kind of offline now. But this is, of course, like a more perfect sort of architectural setting than any white cube ever could be. And I really sort of like that that the artist was playing with that. Even though transporting this concept of the white cube gallery from offline space, he's actually heightening really particular aspects of digital exhibition. The use of the blank white ceiling, the endless kind of navigation into an infinite space. So access is about the sort of non-information hierarchy aspects of presentation. It often brings like a kind of narrative quality to the work that you're presenting, and sort of relates to the non-information architecture parts of interface design. And then finally, the fourth abstraction is social process, which relates to like how exhibitions evolve in dialogue with their audiences. It could be like an open submission. It could be that there's a commenting function. It could be any number of things. I'll just show, like, this is a nice example of this concept also, because in this interface, these circles represent other visitors to the exhibition and the position of their mouse. So you have this experience of viewing the kind of exhibition together, even though even though the exhibition itself isn't changing. Something that's a much more kind of radical use of social process would be the Online Museum of Multiplayer Art, presented by Like in a virtual gallery that they made. This was incredible exhibition where each kind of room was offered its own specific rule set, where you could kind of participate in a role-playing game where you pretended to be a member of a family, or you had to have like a kind of poetry contest. So there are all these like really interesting frameworks for engagement and not much to just sort of look at. So social process really became like the kind of focus of a project like this. So these are four factors that we can think of as part of mise-en-scène. All of them add up to create what I would call the exhibition's narrative, the way in which it tells a story about the works shown. And the piece of it that I haven't mentioned yet, of course, is the actual text of the exhibition itself, which I think of as like not really part of mise-en-scène. It's really just the exhibition's text. But of course, like captions and instructions are an important part of how we tell stories in curating online exhibitions. It can be curatorial text that interprets. It can just be like instructions about how to use it. But of course, that textual element, along with mise-en-scène, is really what constructs that performatic scene of the exhibition as a whole. So exhibition text can be considered slightly distinct from, but in concert with, mise-en-scène. So I wanted to end with a little reflection on the concept of mise-en-scène, because I think it's kind of interesting that montage theory has played such an important role in new media theory. In particular, we can look at Lev Manovich's Language of New Media again, where the concept of montage appears regularly. Manovich refers to the filmmaker Dziga Vertov and his film Men with a Movie Camera to talk about how this theory of montage as kind of synthesizing a reality from disparate parts drawn from a database really represents what new media is all about. So in thinking about mise-en-scène in online exhibitions, of course, I had to revisit The Rules of the Game by Jean-Renoir, which is maybe like the opposite movie in film history from Men with a Movie Camera. And this film was taken up by the critic André Bazin, writing in post-World War II France. So Bazin was kind of like arguing often against the importance and primacy of montage, which had been kind of espoused by Eisenstein as a revolutionary language of cinema. For Bazin, montage, that bringing together of shots, could only ever be an ellipsis, a kind of fake. In its place, Bazin favored long takes, with action taking place in a multi-layered space from foreground to background. So in Rules of the Game, this film we see on screen here, action spills in and out of corridors while the camera seems to wander like a confused party guest. But its partial view creates an openness to interpretation. In deep focus, long take films, the viewer can, so to speak, do the editing in his or her own head. In short, deep focus cinematography invites an awareness of both personal freedom and ethical responsibility. Similarly, if we take mise en scène rather than montage as the basis for a language of online exhibitions, we decenter the curator's synthesis of meaning and emphasize instead the exhibition as a process in which the visitor may take an active role, an open-ended process involving the dynamic interplay of many elements that are outside of the curator's control. This open-endedness is often perceived as a threat, but it is in fact a unique quality of the online exhibition. The online exhibition, like a Renoir film, speaks to a world that spills beyond the edges of the frame or of the screen. I would argue that visiting an online exhibition should welcome forms of attention that recall the surrealist approach to cinema going, which involved traveling from one darkened theater to another to view snippets of films, hoping to generate unsettling juxtapositions in the process. The surrealist cinema goer was undisciplined and creative. It is the complex play between me, you, them, the film, the cinema building, and the world outside that enables us, on occasion, to experience reality more completely, and as in dreams, to see in the dark. But rather than that subversive and oniric kind of quality, I would argue that many online exhibitions today are struggling with a situation that is more similar to the problems that faced people in West Berlin at the height of the Cold War. In 1968, filmmaker Jerry Shum noted that there were issues with staging exhibitions behind the Iron Curtain. Not only must works of art be flown into the city, but also critics and visitors from West Germany experienced difficulty in reaching Berlin. Television, he realized, could allow artworks and visitors to be connected across long distances and closed borders. And so with Ursula Weavers, he launched a television gallery, Fernseh Gallery. So rather than trying to embrace like a kind of radical mode of viewing and a new relationship with art, the gallery was initially sparked by this problem of access, so a very concrete problem, not very poetic, but certainly very practically important. But across two exhibitions, Land Art in 1969 and De-Identifications in 1970, and two intervention-based projects, Fernseh Gallery entered into a dialogue with contemporary and conceptual artists, aiming to bring them into contact with the broader public. So in working closely with artists to develop works, Fernseh Gallery ended up addressing the specificities of the moving image and in some cases of television itself. So it moved from this problem of access to a more productive engagement with the entire situation of reception. Several works in Fernseh Gallery resonated with the specific temporality of television viewing. The living sculpture of Gilbert and George, shown here, showed the two artists motionless on a television screen. For a viewer that encountered it unexpectedly, it might suggest a glitch, a film frame stuck in a gate, or a performer who forgot their lines during one of the many live performances that happened on television at that time, until a puff of a cigarette breaks the tension. Or another notable work, Jan Dibetz's TV as Fireplace, addresses the space of reception for television itself, the living room. At a moment in which domestic architecture in West Berlin homes was newly reoriented around the television instead of the fireplace, Tibetz's decision to screen a nightly burning Yule log called attention to this set of domestic architectural conditions. So here we went from this problem of accessing art to a kind of more broad consideration of a situation of viewing and a temporality and a set of conditions that that were certainly key to understanding the media environment as a whole. So in closing, this is my hope for online exhibitions today, that we take this moment of access issues and move with it into a more specific and poetic relationship with online exhibition and with gallery exhibition as a whole.